You fell in love, but not with him. You fell in love with the story your wound was desperate to write. Because projection is a silent thief. It doesn't warn, it doesn't shout, it doesn't reason. It slips into every gesture, paints hope, over silence, and dresses a mirage as destiny. I've known him my whole life, you say. He makes me feel alive, you whisper. And while you thought you were looking outward, you were really gazing into the abyss of your own longing. That lonely corner that never received a deep enough embrace. Every word of his, every touch, carried the imprint of your own lack. And, in your urgency to be seen, you found in him a refuge for your incomplete self. But what happens when the image unravels? When the ghost of your desire stops projecting and reveals the shadow that was always inside you? Then, the mirror shatters. And all that remains is the raw light of truth. Did you love the person, or the reflection of your wound? You thought you were choosing him, but it was your wound that pointed, your loneliness that nodded, your unmet need that whispered, "He will make you whole." This is the trick of the inverted mirror. It doesn't show us the world. It shows us the place where we are still bleeding. You looked at him and saw familiarity, not because you truly knew him, but because his presence echoed something ancient inside you, a longing you had learned to survive with. Not a soulmate, but a symbol. Carl Jung spoke of this, how what is unconscious in us doesn't remain quiet. It seeks form, it projects. It uses the canvas of the other to paint what we are unwilling or unready to face. In this way, love becomes less of a relationship and more of a reenactment. You weren't falling for him. You were falling into your past, into the arms of a ghost that had his face. This is how projection works. It's not fantasy, it's emotional survival. It allows us to approach the unbearable in a form we think we can hold, and so you held him, not as he was, but as you needed him to be. Attentive, so you could finally feel visible. Protective, so your inner child could finally rest. Loving, so the emptiness could finally be quiet. But the more you needed from the illusion, the more fragile it became. The more tightly you clung to the image, the more it began to fracture under the weight of your expectation, because no one can carry what we've disowned. And no one can be responsible for a wound they didn't inflict. Still, you tried. Tried to make the reflection real. Tried to anchor a dream to a human being. And when the cracks began to show, you called it betrayal, not knowing it was your own unconscious that had betrayed you, by promising that healing could come from someone else's presence. He never lied to you. You lied to yourself, without realizing, because the child inside you still believes in magic, that someone someday will see her fully, love her unconditionally, and finally make it safe to exist. But projection is not magic. It is repetition. It is the looping of pain disguised as romance. It is the mind saying, "This time it will be different," when in truth, you're still standing in front of the same mirror. Only the face inside it has changed. So how do you break the mirror? How do you see clearly, without distortion? You begin by turning your gaze inward, not to punish yourself, not to blame, but to witness, gently, courageously, where the image was first born. Because until you hold yourself in the places you once outsourced, until you love the parts of you you've buried in others, you will never truly love them. Only what they represent, only the reflection. And reflections, no matter how vivid, cannot hold you. They can only show you what you've forgotten you are. You called it love, but it was hunger, not for them, but for what they symbolized. We do not fall for people. We fall into the gaps they seem to fill, into the warmth we were once denied, into the safety we never knew we craved until someone unknowingly mimicked it. This is the architecture of unconscious desire. It builds its longing from absence. It remembers what was missing even when the conscious mind has forgotten. That's why some people make your chest tighten when they enter. the room, why your body remembers before your words do. Because it is not them you're drawn to. It's the echo of a father who didn't stay long enough to show you your worth. The echo of a mother whose love came with a price. The echo of the moment your child heart decided that love must be earned with silence, with effort, with sacrifice. So when he arrived, with his eyes, his voice, his timing, he didn't just arrive in the present. He arrived in your nervous system. He walked straight into your earliest memory of needing to be seen and not being met. And that's why it felt so powerful, so real, so irreplaceable. Because for a second, the wound felt heard. But here's the truth no one wants to say. You were not in love with him. You were in love with what your pain projected onto him. This is not your fault. This is how the psyche protects itself. By recreating the original scene and casting new characters, hoping the ending will be different this time. You didn't want him to hold you. You wanted to go back in time and rewrite the moment where you were left empty-handed. But no one can mother you backwards. No one can father you into peace, not because they don't love you, but because that work is sacred. And sacred work cannot be outsourced. And yet it hurts. Of course it hurts. Because when you see the truth, you also see the illusion you've built your hopes on. You feel the crash, the collapse, the weight of every time you said, "This is it," only to find yourself abandoned by a dream, not a person. So what now? Now you grieve. Not just him, but the version of you who believed she had finally found home. You grieve the child within who keeps walking into fire thinking this time it will warm her, not burn. And in that grief, something strange begins to shift. Something raw, something honest. You begin to realize that what you sought in him has always been a map to your own emptiness. You did not love him. You loved the feeling of being chosen. You loved the temporary illusion that your ache had finally been answered. But the truth is, he was a messenger. And messengers, by nature, are not meant to stay. They arrive, reveal, and then dissolve. So, let him go. Let the illusion dissolve with him. And in the quiet that follows, you will feel it. The ache that's always been yours. The ache you kept trying to feed with someone else's hands. Now, you hold it. Now, you listen. Now, you ask, what is it that I have always lacked, and how can I give it to myself without turning another person into a lifeline? There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when love begins to distort, when the other becomes less a person and more a placeholder, not for companionship, but for the parts of you you still cannot bear to see, because it's not always the light that we seek in others. Sometimes it's the darkness we've disowned, and rather than face it alone, we outsource it. We make them carry what we cannot hold. This is the hidden economy of projection. Jung called it the shadow, the unseen, unclaimed, rejected fragments of the self that we exile into the other. You didn't just love him, you loaded him with expectations, fantasies, fears, unfinished stories. You made him the antagonist of every wound, the redeemer of every silent scream, the proof that it was never you who was too much, too little, or too late. And so, you watched him, not to see him, but to monitor the reflection. Did he call back? Did he notice your silence? Did he reach for you without being asked? Each moment a test, each absence a confirmation, not of his truth, but of your pain, because the shadow is clever. It doesn't come dressed as fear. It comes dressed as righteousness, as intuition, as I deserve better. But underneath, what it's really saying is, I cannot face this part of myself, so I will make it his fault. It is easier to blame the other than to admit how much we've betrayed ourselves to keep them. Easier to call them cold than to confront the part of you that settled for crumbs and called it a feast. And when they finally leave, as they always do, because no one can carry what we've buried, you say, he couldn't love me. But maybe he couldn't love the version of himself that your shadow forced him to become. We say we want connection, but what we often want is reflection. We want to see the beautiful parts of ourselves mirrored back, our depth, our care, our tenderness, but we forget mirrors don't choose what they reflect. So eventually he began to mirror what you did not want to see. Your desperation, your unworthiness, your emotional abandonment of self. And instead of turning inward, you turned on him. You made him the container of your ache, the villain of your story. But he was never that. He was simply the projection, screen on which your unconscious played its oldest film. Not because you are broken, but because you are human. And every human being, until they awaken, uses the other as a mask, a mirror, a maze. But what if love is not meant to complete you, but to reveal you? What if relationships are not sanctuaries but initiations, not safe harbors but sacred storms that wash up everything you've hidden? The truth is this: until you face your shadow, you will always think they are the problem. You will always chase, accuse, abandon, or beg, not because of who they are, but because of who you have not yet faced within, and the one you haven't faced is you. At first it feels like confusion, a slow unraveling. You stare at them and something doesn't align. Their smile no longer softens your edges. Their silence feels heavier than before. Their absence echoes louder. The spell is breaking. This is the moment the image collapses, the moment the projection begins to return to its source. And it is not gentle. You once saw him as salvation, a harbor for your ache, a face for your longing. You swore the connection was divine, that the chemistry was a sign. But signs can be misread. And chemistry often speaks the language of trauma, because when pain recognizes pain, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, "Home." You didn't see him. You saw what you wanted to believe, what your wound begged you to see. And for a while, the illusion was enough. Enough to silence your questions, enough to numb your fear, enough to make you feel chosen finally. But illusions do not age well. They decay, they peel, they expose. And now, as you sit across from him, you notice the void. Not just between you, but within you. The same void that was there before he came, quiet and unclaimed. The collapse doesn't arrive in one blow. It unspools slowly, like film catching fire. You begin to see the moments you ignored, the small betrayals you rationalized, the coldness you turned into mystery, the inconsistency you called complexity. Not because he fooled you, but because you needed the dream to stay alive. You built a cathedral of hope on his silhouette. And now every brick is crumbling under the weight of your awakening. He is not who you made him. He is not your father's redemption, not your mother's apology, not the answer to the question you've never dared ask aloud. Am I worthy without being needed? And so what now? Grief. Yes, but not for him, not really. For the image. For the version of you who once believed love could be earned if she just gave enough, stayed small enough, hurt quietly enough. The collapse hurts because it reveals the architecture of your hope. It shows you where you betrayed yourself just to feel safe in someone else. But hidden within that collapse is something sacred: clarity. The mirror shatters, and for the first time, you are not looking outward. You are looking at the pieces, at the reflection of a self you have never truly met, not in the eyes of a lover, but in the silence that follows his departure. It is in this stillness that truth begins to speak, and what it says is not cruel. It is liberating. It says, you made him into a home because you never had one within. You loved the idea of being seen because you've never learned to witness yourself. And now, you can begin. Begin to see not what he lacked, but what you sought. Not where he failed, but where you fragmented. This is not your ending. It is your return. Not to the illusion, but to the origin. Not to the love story you tried to write with someone else's ink, but to the truth only your own voice can tell. Now that the mirror is broken, you stand alone. but not in abandonment. In truth. No longer distracted by the silhouette of the other, you begin to hear your own voice again. Faint at first, then clearer. Like music rising from beneath the rubble of everything you once outsourced. This is the return. Not dramatic, not loud, but sacred. Because coming back to yourself after a lifetime of projecting your worth onto others feels less like a celebration and more like a quiet reckoning. You look around at the emotional ruins, the remnants of fantasy, the grief of self-betrayal, the echo of almosts that were never real. But you also begin to notice something else. Space. Space where the illusion used to live. Space where pain once dictated your choices. Space where, for the first time, you are not desperate to be chosen because you are beginning to choose you. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And for years, that's what love felt like. Fate. The magnetic pull toward the one who mirrored your wound just right. But now you see. It wasn't fate. It was familiarity. It was your history disguised as chemistry. It was trauma performing the illusion of destiny, so you stop, you breathe. You ask yourself questions you've never dared speak. What do I actually feel? Without someone reflecting it back to me. What do I desire, without the need to be validated? Who am I, without being seen through someone else's eyes? And, slowly, you begin to build a relationship with the only person who has lived every version of you. Yourself. This isn't the glamorous kind of healing. It doesn't look good on Instagram. It looks like going to bed alone and not shrinking from it. It looks like crying when no one is there to witness it and letting the tears fall anyway. It looks like forgiving yourself for all the ways you tried to survive by handing your soul to someone who never knew how to hold it. And more than anything, it looks like stopping the search. Not because love is no longer desired, but because love is no longer required to prove you exist. Now, when someone enters your life, you don't ask them to fix you. You don't demand they carry the ache you now know is yours. You meet them eye to eye, not heart to whole. You speak from fullness, not hunger. And you know, if they leave, you remain. Because this is what healing from projection looks like. You reclaim every piece you once gave away just to feel enough. You stop handing your worth to those unequipped to honor it. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop confusing pain for passion. You stop. You breathe. You begin again. This time, not with your wounds leading the way, but with your wholeness. You return not to who you were before the heartbreak, but to who you were beneath it all along. The self that waited patiently behind the projections, beneath the ache, beyond the illusion. And that self, the one no longer hidden, in mirrors and does not beg to be seen, she simply is. To see without projecting is not to see perfectly, it is to see honestly, stripped of illusion, freed from the unconscious contract that says, "You will be who I need, so I don't have to meet myself." Because that is what projection always was, or an evasion, a beautiful, tragic bypass of your own becoming. To project is to hand someone else the blueprint of your buried longing, and then resent them when they fail to build the castle you imagined. But now you've begun to gather the pieces. You've watched the mirror crack. You've tasted the bitter clarity that comes when the image dies. So what remains? Now, the work begins. The sacred, tender, terrifying work of seeing without illusion. Of meeting someone without asking them to carry your story. Of loving not what they reflect, but what they truly are. You will notice perhaps that the intensity fades. The intoxicating high of projection disappears. But in its place, something quieter arrives. Presence. To love without projecting is to walk beside someone, not ahead of them in fantasy nor behind them in fear. It is to witness without needing, to speak without performing, to feel without collapsing. It is the end of manipulation disguised as longing, the end of seduction as a survival strategy, the end of the unconscious question, will you finally love the parts of me I refuse to claim? No, they won't. That is not their task. It never was. And when you stop demanding that they do, when you finally release them from the role your past assigned, you begin to taste what love was always meant to be, not a cure, not a rescue, but a mirror you can choose to stand in front of, with full awareness of what belongs to you and what never did. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, but wholeness, to reclaim every projection and place it back into your own hands. To say, this is mine. This is not yours to fix, to soothe, to carry. And then, only then, can intimacy become real. Because now, you are not loving with your wound. You are loving with your eyes open. You are not searching for salvation. You are choosing to see without turning the other into a screen, to listen without decoding everything as threat or promise, to hold without gripping, to walk away, if needed, not from pain but from clarity. And in this space, something sacred returns. Yourself. The self that no longer needs to be mirrored in someone else's gaze. The self that no longer mistakes recognition for love. The self that knows you were never too much. You simply handed your depth to someone too afraid to dive. Now you dive for yourself. You reclaim your projections, your pain, your power, and from this place and whole, awake, unmasked, you begin again. Not to be chosen, but to choose, with presence, with peace, with eyes wide open. If this shattered something in you, good. Sometimes the mirror must break so the soul can finally see itself clearly. Now tell me, what part of you did you keep projecting onto them? And what are you reclaiming starting today? Leave it in the comments. Not just for you, but for the ones who are still lost in their reflection. And if this spoke to your ache, subscribe, because the work of becoming is only just beginning.